Consumption Guilt, Existential Guilt, and System Guilt in Times of Climate Change by Sebastian Friedrich. Over the course of its short history, humankind has learned to harness forces far beyond its physical capabilities. One example: if a reasonably well-trained person wants to dig a hole with a shovel, they can exert approximately 150 watts of power over an extended period. However, if they use an ultra-high-performance excavator, it amounts to 750,000 watts, equivalent to the strength of about 5,000 people. Humanity's ability to appropriate nature on an unprecedented scale has produced an unimaginable amount of artifacts, an estimated 30 trillion tons. This is one reason why geology now speaks of a technosphere that has developed alongside the atmosphere, biosphere, and hydrosphere. In fact, we might even be in a new geological epoch, as meteorologist Paul J. Crutzen and biologist Eugene F. Stormer suggested in 2000, proposing the term Anthropocene. Although the concept remains scientifically controversial, the term has since gained remarkable traction in public discourse. The beginning of the Anthropocene is generally dated to the mid-20th century, marked by the Great Acceleration, a period when carbon dioxide and methane concentrations in the atmosphere began to rise sharply. The Earth warmed, the oceans became increasingly acidic, and human expansion led to a dramatic increase in species extinction rates for flora and fauna. The discourse on the Anthropocene implies an answer to the question of who is responsible for the world's ills. Most agree. We are all guilty of climate change, global warming, and environmental destruction. Starting from this premise, an analysis of the nuances of blame in popular climate discourse reveals two fundamental forms: consumption guilt and existential guilt. Consumption guilt. The history of modern consumption guilt is closely linked to the history of the beverage can. The beverage can began its triumphal march in the U.S. in 1933. After the end of Prohibition, a brewery came up with the idea of packaging beer not in bottles or barrels, as before the alcohol ban, but in aluminum cans. After a successful test phase, the new form of packaging officially hit the market on January 24, 1935, which is why this day is now marketed as Beer Can Appreciation Day. Billions of cans were soon sold in the U.S., containing not just beer but also soda. For beer and soda manufacturers, the new container was a blessing. On the one hand, many customers believed their drinks tasted better in cans. On the other hand, manufacturers saved a significant amount of money by using the new container, as the cans could simply be discarded after consumption. When discussions about introducing a deposit system for cans emerged, beverage and packaging manufacturers took action. Since they naturally wanted to avoid the associated costs, they turned the tables and founded Keep America Beautiful in 1953, today one of the most well-known environmental organizations in the U.S. Keep America Beautiful developed various campaigns to scandalize environmental pollution and promote individual recycling. Perhaps the most famous commercial comes from 1971. It shows an actor dressed as a Native American, standing by a busy road when a bag of trash is thrown at his feet from a passing car. The man then turns his head toward the camera, and a tear can be seen running from the folds under his right eye. A voiceover states, "People start pollution. People can stop it." The commercial appeared at a time when environmental awareness among the public was increasing, as climate scientist Michael E. Mann recalls. The advertisement delivered the right message at the right time. You and I can solve this problem. We just have to use our intelligence, pull ourselves together, and roll up our sleeves. The political context of the clip, which has gone down in advertising history as the Crying Indian, is revealing. It was part of a larger campaign against initiatives to introduce bottle deposit laws in various states. These initiatives sought to make the beverage industry bear part of the costs of returning cans and aimed to oblige them to process the returned cans. The goal of the advertising campaign was likely to prevent government regulations that would have been costly for companies and instead shift the discourse toward individual recycling, following the motto that John Paul Austin, then CEO of Coca-Cola, articulated in a speech to bankers shortly before the commercial's release. The government cannot solve our problem, but the people can do something. The campaign was successful. Only a few states managed to implement a can deposit law. The philosopher Grégoire Chamaillou cites this example as paradigmatic for the method of responsibilization, which calls on individuals to act independently. A technique of governance, an art of ruling others by compelling them to manage themselves. An art of ruling others by activating in them a reflective capacity for self-regulation, an autonomy within heteronomy. The advertising example also reveals that the responsibilization of some is the evasion of others. What the Keep America Beautiful commercial was for the 1970s, Al Gore became for the late 2000s. Before Greta Thunberg, the politician and almost president of the US, was perhaps the world's most famous climate change messenger. A few years after his failed presidential bid, he traveled the world speaking about climate change, documented in the film An Inconvenient Truth. Gore's core message, articulated in a key phrase, strongly echoes the 1970s advertisement. Each of us is a cause of global warming, but each of us can also make changes. With the products we buy, how we use electricity, the cars we drive. Throughout the film, Gore claims that climate change can be stopped through individual purchasing decisions, and as the credits begin to roll, a voiceover urgently asks, "Are you ready to change the way you live? The climate crisis can be solved." This is followed by various suggestions on how small everyday changes can make a big difference. Energy-saving appliances, thermostats with timers, LED bulbs, recycling, planting trees. The film was released in 2006 and became the third most successful documentary of all time. In 2007, it won an Oscar. Around the same time, the idea of the ecological footprint began to gain traction. The concept was originally developed in the mid-1990s by Swiss urban planner Mathis Wackernagel as part of his dissertation. Initially, it aimed to determine how many Earths would be needed if the entire human population lived like the inhabitants of the global North. In the mid-2000s, while in New York, Wackernagel made an astonishing observation. Everywhere, in the subway, on billboards, in newspaper ads, the question was displayed, what on earth is a carbon footprint? It was part of a campaign by the oil corporation British Petroleum, BP, which soon launched an online portal where individuals could calculate their personal CO2 emissions. BP, one of the most environmentally harmful companies in the world, began presenting itself as an environmentally conscious corporation committed to renewable energy. Years later, Wackernagel told Tess that he had no knowledge of the BP campaign. However, he quickly recognized the danger of moralizing climate and environmental issues. This is why he eventually stopped urging his audiences in lectures to reduce their individual footprints. In the eyes of climate scientist Michael E. Mann, the campaigns by BP and Keep America Beautiful are similar. Just as the commercial places the focus on the individual's role in eliminating bottle and can waste, the emphasis on the individual's role in solving climate change was also carefully promoted by industry. Such a perspective shifts the causes and responsibilities of climate change onto individuals and diverts attention from structural changes that would ultimately affect corporations as well. Fossil capital is fond of promoting the ecological footprint because it appears harmless and inevitable. As sociologist Linus Westhuser notes, footprints are left almost automatically, ironically, even in the most climate-friendly way of getting around. Thinking in terms of CO2 footprints encourages a logic of incremental savings through light bulbs, bike rides, and shopping habits. Necessary transformations of production methods remain politely unmentioned. Despite this, Keep America Beautiful campaigns, Al Gore, and the ecological footprint all convey the same message in different ways. The responsibility to act ultimately lies with the individual, with us. This discourse produces the corresponding subjectivation. The emphasis on seemingly objective guilt, if repeated long and persistently enough, can evoke deeply personal reactions such as shame. Widely discussed phenomena like flight shame, meat shaming, or plastic shame illustrate how certain guilt attributions have become ingrained in our individual consciousness and even our bodies. Feelings of guilt and shame can take on a religious character when they touch on the realm of sin, as seen in the case of so-called climate sins. People with a secular climate consciousness today make use of the possibility of digital confession. By admitting ecological transgressions on social media, they seek forgiveness from the digital community. While consumption guilt addresses the actions of each individual and considers every unethical consumer guilty, generational guilt is a more specific variant of consumption guilt. Here, the blame falls particularly on the older generation. Boomers, for example, become climate boomers. Climate change and generational conflict are increasingly intertwined, especially since the German Constitutional Court ruled in 2021 that climate protection is a matter of intergenerational justice. The public reception of the ruling often follows a logic similar to discussions about the debt brake. The older generation has enjoyed decades of prosperity, and now the younger generation has to pay the bill. Another facet of consumption guilt is the recently growing criticism of the upper middle class and the super rich. Here, the purchase of unnecessary goods and a wasteful lifestyle are condemned. Flying in private jets, cruising on luxury liners, driving around in SUVs. All of these perspectives contain a kernel of truth. One doesn't even have to think only of the super rich. If everyone on Earth lived like the average German, there would be 3 times as many cars worldwide, meat consumption would nearly double, and significantly more airplanes would have to take to the skies. Accordingly, the average per capita greenhouse gas emissions in Germany are about 60% higher than the global average. The higher the standard of living, the more consumption takes place, and the worse it is for the environment and climate. In fact, the baby boomer generation leads the way in climate-damaging lifestyles and is likely responsible for about 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions. Still, the focus on consumption behavior, whether that of individuals, older generations, or the wealthy, proves questionable. Even the most superficial look at the issue makes it clear that calling for a shift in individual attitudes is too short-sighted. Greater environmental awareness hardly leads automatically to behavioral change. This phenomenon, known as the environmental attitude-behavior gap, has puzzled researchers across disciplines for decades. Even Michael Bilhards, responsible for promoting sustainable consumption at the German Environment Agency, admitted in a 2019 interview the limits of raising awareness. We have done a lot of reflection, a lot of critical reflection. We have many possibilities for what we can do, and sometimes do in individual cases. But in fact, if we look at the CO2 balance, we have to unfortunately say that not much has changed among consumers in the last 10 or 15 years. Despite decades of continuous messaging aimed at increasing awareness of climate and environmental issues, behavioral changes remain elusive. But even if greater environmental and climate awareness were to lead to corresponding actions, the question of the lasting impact of ethical consumption under the conditions of our societal structure remains. Since democracy in the global north is primarily limited to electing parliaments, rather than determining production and distribution of goods, individual consumers have virtually no influence over the often lengthy production chains. Even the most tentative political attempts to enforce minimal standards in supply chains fail due to resistance from capital and its lobbyists. Within the existing infrastructures, production methods, and political institutions, the scope for individual action is ultimately extremely limited. Even someone living in poverty, without a car and never flying, still exceeds the target ecological footprint of 2 tons per year. This all demonstrates the limitations of appeals to ethical consumption. It is certainly reasonable to reflect on one's own consumption, consider one's personal impact on climate change and environmental destruction, and adjust one's actions toward a more resource-conscious existence. However, a narrow focus on oneself offers no real perspective for fundamental change. And yet, supposedly solution-oriented strategies directed at individuals continue to resonate, partly because they align with a decades-long discourse of neoliberal subject formation, which has established personal responsibility as the highest principle of societal action. Each individual is responsible for the whole, but the whole is not responsible for the individual. Nearly 50 years ago, the philosopher Michel Foucault described the power technique underlying this notion as governmentality, the seeming freedom of the population is not entirely restricted so that liberal rule does not lose its hold. If it intervenes too much, it undermines itself. External discipline does not disappear but is supplemented by self-discipline. This self-discipline has merged with a subjectivism that, over the past decades, has gained traction across both the left and the right. Some have claimed that society no longer truly exists, only individuals. Others have taken the slogan, "The personal is political," so literally that the politicization of the private turned into the privatization of politics, with introspection becoming the guiding principle of social critique. When the end of grand narratives was proclaimed, all that remained was the politics of small steps. Those who focus only on the present dismiss anyone who seeks to discuss social conflicts of interest. The former call for creative minds to devise technical solutions within the narrow boundaries of the existing system to solve contemporary problems. Some want to set a good example and at least make small changes, while others seek to engineer climate change away in cooperation with capital. Some try to extinguish a forest fire with a water pistol, while others stand by holding a torch. Existential guilt. While consumption guilt focuses on the individual, at the other end of the spectrum of hegemonic guilt attribution, the gaze shifts to humanity as a whole. The best means to counter human-caused climate and environmental destruction, according to this view, would be for fewer or even no humans to be made at all. Under the hashtag birthstrike, women, particularly from the USA and the UK, exchange views on the decision to forego having children to curb the feared negative consequences of climate change. A questionable Swedish study is often cited in these discussions, which ranks children as the greatest climate killers, above cars and airplanes. Dennis and Donella Meadows, co-authors of the famous Limits to Growth study commissioned by the Club of Rome, also advocate voluntary childlessness as a means to save the environment and climate. According to the Meadows, growth is not only an economic issue, but also a demographic one. In an interview with Süddeutsche Zeitung, Dennis Meadows stated, "I think we currently have too many people on the planet." When asked whether he had ever regretted not having children, he replied, "If you really want to care for a small human being, my goodness, there are billions of them. There's no reason to create your own." The climate political antinatalism of the Meadows, or the #birthstrike supporters, declares humanity in general, and parents in particular, to be responsible for the climate crisis, thereby connecting to the ideas of Thomas Robert Malthus. At the end of the 18th century, Malthus predicted a population catastrophe. Since the world's population was growing exponentially, while food production was increasing only linearly, he argued that the population would have to shrink drastically to prevent mass starvation. Malthus's predictions did not come true, despite significant population growth. The British economist miscalculated and failed to account for technological advancements in agriculture. Today, a climate-oriented neo-Malthusianism also finds supporters on the left, including the author Verena Brunschweiger, who justifies her program of childlessness as follows. Capitalism is a system based on consumption and wage slavery. Every worker must sell their labor power to some capitalist in order to make a living. Through reproduction, we create new wage slaves, and no one is obligated to do that. I also don't want to create new consumers. There are already far too many in the global north, who in turn are destroying the global south. So why add more resource consumption and more waste through even more children in this world? This argument challenges the assumption that social conditions are historically developed. Instead, the capitalist forms of reproduction in society appear as timeless, and human beings are framed solely as wage slaves and agents of destruction. A fundamental premise of leftist thought is the potential transformability of society. The belief that exploitation and the destructive appropriation of natural resources are not inherent laws of human existence. The antinatalism presented here abstracts contemporary social phenomena from their historical context and sees the problem as simply one of excess human population. Climate political neo-Malthusianism and antinatalism deny the possibility that humans could reorganize their reproductive practices, labor structures, and resource management under different conditions. Ultimately, all these antinatalist approaches revolve around renunciation. The renunciation of even considering alternative forms of human relationships, property structures, and modes of organization. One of the hopes of the climate movement was that a universalist apocalyptic narrative could convince people of the urgency of taking action against climate change. That hope does not seem to be materializing at present. Rather, the decline of the climate movement suggests that the 2009 findings of Saffron O'Neill and Sophie Nicholson Cole still hold true. While dramatic and fear-inducing depictions of climate change can heighten awareness of its urgency, they also evoke a sense of helplessness and overwhelm. Against this backdrop, the discourse of existential guilt, as well as positions on climate political antinatalism and neo-Malthusianism, may gain even more traction in the future. This also applies to the most radical variant of antinatalism, the aim of wiping out all of humanity. The voluntary human extinction movement does not advocate the active extermination of humans, but rather the voluntary renunciation of reproduction. The idea is that only through the extinction of humanity can the environment be preserved. This raises the question of whether there is a connection between this desire for annihilation and the omnipresent doomsday scenarios within the climate movement. When a situation appears particularly hopeless and one's own capacity for action feels meaningless, transforming an impending fate into something desirable may serve as a way to overcome the sense of powerlessness. Those who feel literally crushed by what seems to be an inescapable state of the world risk remaining in passive resignation. By reversing the framing, this passivity can be turned into its opposite. The extinction of humanity then no longer appears as a dystopia that leads to paralysis, but rather as the ultimate goal. In the end, the vision of dystopia does not differ from what is sought, yet through this reframing, the no longer feared but instead desired demise of humanity becomes easier to bear. System guilt. Existential guilt focuses on humanity as a whole, while consumption guilt shifts attention to the individual. Both approaches align along a common axis, framing humanity and nature as irreconcilable adversaries. Beyond these two dominant guilt concepts, traces of another argument emerge in climate discourse, one that offers a different perspective on the relationship between humans and nature: system guilt. This perspective becomes particularly visible when the significant contribution of industrial production to CO2 emissions, or economic growth itself, is called into question. Criticism of industrial growth contains a kernel of truth, as the destructive appropriation of natural resources by humans primarily takes place through this process. However, the dominant visual language in popular critiques of growth should raise suspicion. Hardly any television report on climate change omits images of smoking chimneys, yet one must search much harder to find images of the copper mines, often geographically and conceptually distant, where people toil under brutal conditions, or the massive brine pools from which lithium is extracted. While growth in mainstream criticism appears mainly as a problem of the industrial sector, green growth is largely embraced. This uncritical opposition to industrial growth also finds support among certain factions of capital that claim to have distanced themselves from fossil fuel interests. They promote a social ecological market economy, cultivate ties with leading figures in the climate movement, and align themselves with the Green Party. During Germany's 2021 federal election campaign, when it briefly appeared that Annalena Baerbock might become the next chancellor, the Association of German Banks issued a glowing endorsement of the Greens. They might be the first party to understand that the transition to a sustainable economy could only be achieved with the support of banks and capital markets. The focus on system guilt as merely a critique of industrial growth overlooks something fundamental. Even green growth would be destructive under the current conditions of production. Capitalism does not only rely on the exploitation of labor, it necessarily depends on natural resources, which only become usable through human labor. Both laborers and the earth are, as Marx put it, the sources of all wealth. This perspective connects directly to capital accumulation as the fundamental principle of capitalist production. Profits must be reinvested into production to generate more capital. The emphasis is thus on the growth of fixed capital assets, at the expense of wages. Labor is to be minimized, while investments flow primarily into machines, raw materials, and energy-dense fuels. Accumulation and profit maximization are the central purposes of capitalist societies, as social and economic historian Christian Stash highlights, not the satisfaction of needs or a sustainable relationship with nature. Market competitors, whether in traditional or green industries, are driven by scale, competitive advantage, and expanding production capacity. Capital has no inherent interest in a sustainable relationship with nature. Its goal is to preserve the status quo, both the class structure and the relationship between humanity and nature. From capital's perspective, natural resources are a free quarry, providing raw materials that must be processed by human labor. Despite competition for profit realization, capitalists share a common economic interest in maintaining their dominance over nature. As a result, serious environmental regulations would not just harm individual capitalists or specific industries, but would also negatively impact the overall rate of profit. By preserving the existing capital-nature relationship, the capitalist class prevents deductions from surplus value, and thus from the general rate of profit. For corporations, environmental and climate protection measures primarily represent costs, as evidenced by large-scale campaigns designed to shift consumption guilt onto individuals. Likewise, bourgeois states, locked in international competition for the most favorable business conditions, shy away from implementing serious binding regulations. One reason why the emphasis on consumption guilt aligns perfectly with the interests of ruling politics. If the question of system guilt does not stop at critiquing growth, but instead questions the fundamental principles of the entire social system, it stands in contrast to consumption guilt and existential guilt. This is because it clarifies that the real conflict is not between humanity and nature, but between the current social system and the possibilities for the sustainable reproduction of both humanity and nature. Put simply, capitalism is in contradiction with nature. There is an incompatibility between boundless capital accumulation and socio-ecological reproduction cycles. Holding individuals or even humanity as a whole responsible for the destruction of natural resources is as misguided as the concept of the Anthropocene itself. The popular scientific Anthropocene, writes environmental historian Jason W. Moore, is nothing more than the latest version in a long series of environmental concepts whose function has been to deny the many facets of violence and inequality in capitalism and to assure that the problems produced by capital are the responsibility of all humanity. One person who would firmly oppose the call to emphasize the systemic causes of environmental destruction and climate change is the previously cited Dennis Meadows, lead author of the Club of Rome study, The Limits to Growth. On the occasion of the study's 50th anniversary, he stated in Die Zeit, "When people claim that capitalism is the problem, I respond, no, the responsibility lies with us, and capitalism is just one of the tools we use." Meadows' antinatalism seems set in stone, with a corresponding, ultimately conservative view of humanity serving as its cement. Consumption guilt and existential guilt reach the limits of understanding. Neither of these argumentative strands helps us grasp the essential causes of environmental destruction and climate change caused by humans. Nor do they offer approaches to addressing these developments. Instead, the discourses on consumption guilt and existential guilt construct an artificial opposition between humanity and nature, with proponents of existential guilt tending toward ahistorical interpretations and those of consumption guilt toward moralistic ones. The decision to take a flight for a summer vacation, to drive a combustion engine car, or to fulfill the desire to have children remains a personal choice. This will not change. One person finds happiness in the daily consumption of goods marketed to them, while another leads a frugal life. On a global scale, the contribution of both lifestyles to climate change and environmental destruction is nearly identical. More important than getting lost in questions of personal lifestyle choices would be, perhaps collectively, recognizing system guilt and targeting the systemic conditions underlying environmental destruction. Changing these conditions may indeed be far more difficult than making a few behavioral adjustments, but one thing it would certainly be: more sustainable.